I am Emily Eby. I'm a voting rights attorney here at Texas Civil Rights Project, focusing on election protection, but also some policy work. And I am so excited to share with y'all the fifth and final in our voting rights summer CLE series called Common Voting Myths and How to Bust Them. Thank you so much to everybody who has attended this session, whether tonight is your first one or you've been here for all five. I wish we could give you a punch card. We appreciate you very much. And it's been a blast to do these with y'all. All right. If you've been here for more than one of these CLEs, you know that TCRP is Texas Lawyers for Texas Communities. We've been around 32 years now. TCRP is 1 year older than I am, which I think is fun. We're nonpartisan. We have the voting rights program, of course, but also criminal injustice and our Beyond Borders program. And we have done some form of election protection in every election since 2016. And some of the people we do election protection with have been doing it way longer than that. Tonight's presentation is going to be a little bit different. In the past, it has been either me or my colleague Carl or our friend Christina from LDF going through a voting rights policy issue. But tonight we're going to hit a bunch of policy issues and much different from the other presentations. I did not write this one, and Carl did his, but I did not write these, and I am very honored to be the person who just compiled all of this really good information to share with y'all tonight, because I am going to pass on some information from my voting rights heroes. I have a lot of voting rights heroes who did not make it in this presentation, who I did not get to reach out to for it. But by and large, a lot of the folks who I have worked with in Texas voting rights and a lot of the organizations are represented in this presentation tonight. I asked these folks, what is a common myth that you hear around voting? And what do you say when somebody says that? You know, you're sitting around the Thanksgiving table and somebody says, oh, well, voters are apathetic. They just don't really care, or your vote doesn't matter. How do you combat that myth? And got some really great answers. Mostly Texas, one national in there, my friend Jonathan, but these are folks with years of experience with Texas voters, counties, legislators, advocates, disenfranchised Texans, so much more, representing ACLU of Texas, Move Texas, Campaign Legal Center, Disability Rights Texas, League of Women Voters of Texas, and of course, the Texas Civil Rights Project. Of course, again, the list of organizations and people I admire is not exhaustive in this presentation. We're going to start with one of these myths that I referenced in the intro. I talked to Amber Mills. She gave me a lot of great stuff, so I'm largely just going to read to you what she said. But Move Texas does a lot of voter registration work. Texas Civil Rights Project is more of the election side, the voting rights side, but Move does both voting rights advocacy and voter registration. So a myth that Amber encounters a lot in her work at Move Texas, especially with young people who Move is geared towards. She says, while out trying to register people to vote or sharing information about local propositions on the ballot, we often are met with at least one person who says, oh, I don't actually vote. My vote doesn't matter anyway. My natural instinct is I want to give them a big shake and yell, of course it does, but I refrain. Hard to imagine Amber really, shaking anyone, but I believe that the passion is there. She says she always chooses to hear them out rather than dismiss their concerns, because she says, I have to know where they're coming from to understand how I might be able to convince them otherwise. If it's about the complexity of the voting process, I try to break it down and streamline it to be as simple as possible, or give recommendations to make it a little bit less of a hassle. Some folks are saying, oh, my vote doesn't matter, but they're saying that because they are afraid to go through the process, or they think it's too complicated, or they don't know what questions to ask. And Amber says if that's the case with the person, she loves to give them helpful recommendations, such as calling the 866-OUR-VOTE hotline if they face any problems while voting. the other option is that they might be disillusioned with the democratic process. Amber says that takes a little bit more of a custom, patient, tailored approach. Amber says, my go-to move is to focus on local elections because as a young person talking to young people, I understand that often our ideal candidate, if one even exists, isn't always going to make it on the ballot. But there are so many other seats, from judges to city council to state reps, who have more of a say in policies that will directly affect us and our communities, as well as those folks being much more accessible to voters in terms of being able to meet with them, being able to talk to them. Plus, local elections have a much lower turnout, obviously, than national elections, which literally means your vote actually does count a lot more. Amber says she also likes to share examples of narrow vote margins. She says it doesn't always come down to a single vote, although that has happened. And she sent me a really interesting article where with like 10 different examples of a single vote making a huge difference, which was really fun to read. But those are obviously few and far between. She says in many elections, it does come down to slim margins. For example, this summer in this region, Texas 28 here, Jessica Cisneros lost the Democratic primary to Henry Cuellar in Texas 28 by 289 votes. It's hard to imagine, me as one person, oh, does my vote count? Is my vote going to make the difference? But it's easy to imagine 289 people. That's, not to pass any judgment, but that's a relatively small Facebook friend pool for a lot of us, I think. It was smaller than my high school graduating class. And if the enthusiasm is infectious, that can easily affect 289 people, as well as the disillusionment. If people are thinking, oh, my vote won't make a difference, it's easy to see that multiplying times 289 within small networks and small communities. The last thing Amber says is that her ultimate argument to combat the "my vote doesn't matter" myth is that she firmly believes that voting is an act of community care. It's how we show our friends, families, coworkers, or anyone else we care for that their fight is not theirs to endure alone. Voting in the interests of those you care about actually means a lot to them. I love this one, and I know that it feels kind of silly to say, if someone says my vote doesn't matter, saying, well, it matters in your heart. But I think it really is true that whatever values you have, one of the best ways that you can actually invest them back into the greater good is to go to the polling place and vote. I love this quote, excerpted it, just read it out loud, but like to have it up. And that's our wisdom from Amber on how to convince folks that their vote actually does matter. All right, Sarah Chen is one of our staff attorneys here at Texas Civil Rights Project. She is involved in our SB1 litigation, and she is leading our Galveston local redistricting litigation. I would highly recommend checking out the TCRP website and learning more about the Galveston litigation. It's especially very, very interesting. But Sarah's myth, she had several. A lot of these folks had several, which is really fun. Good discussions. But Sarah's myth is that Texas voters have to vote at their own assigned polling place in their own precinct. And the truth is that many Texas voters can vote at any polling place in their county. The way they can do this is through countywide polling. This is a program that Texas runs where I'll explain in order. Countywide polling adapts the current system of Texas voting for counties who apply and are approved by the Secretary of State for it. So basically, anywhere in Texas, if you're registered to vote in that county, you can vote anywhere in that county at any polling place during early voting. That is for all 254. No matter what county you're in, you can vote at any polling place in your county during early voting. You can vote near your home, your school, your kids' daycare, whatever the case may be. By default, the standard system in Texas voters can only vote in their precinct on election day. That's often just an assigned polling place. They say, you go to the local Masonic Hall or whatever the case may be. But if a county applies and is accepted for the countywide polling program, voters in those counties can vote at any polling place in their county on election day. So who has countywide polling? I know it's like the county has to apply and get approved, blah, blah, blah. But the good news is that most Texans are in a countywide polling county already. 84 counties are participating in countywide polling. 43% of the counties who allow you to vote anywhere at your polling place on election day began in 2018 or later. And I mention this for a couple reasons. First, because Harris County really led the charge on that. The woman who was at Harris County, one of the women who was at Harris County at the time, Roxanne Werner, had a giant binder of how Harris County applied and was approved and told me she would share it with any county in Texas who wanted to apply. And second, in 2018 was when Texas Civil Rights Project, along with Move Texas and Texas Freedom Network and later Common Cause Texas, began our Democracy from the Ground Up program. It's a great way that we went to counties and said, hey, the state's not going to influence voting rights for the better, but there's a lot of stuff you can do at the county level. And one of the first planks of Democracy from the Ground Up was telling them, you can do countywide polling and make it so much easier for your voters. And 43% of the counties that have countywide polling have happened since then, which is really exciting, especially since Texas only offers a limited number of slots each year for who can get approved for countywide polling. About 23.5 million Texans live in counties with countywide polling. That's not voters, it's just population. And about 5 million folks live in non-countywide polling counties. If you're interested in whether or not your county is countywide polling, you can go to this tinyurl.com/checkcwpp. Countywide polling is huge. It is something that has just grown so much in the past few years and is relatively new even before that. And one of the worst calls we used to get for election protection was somebody saying, it's election day, it's 6:30 p.m., polls close in half an hour, I'm told I'm at the wrong polling place and I won't be able to make it to my correct polling place in time. And what I love about countywide polling is that it just completely eliminates that problem. All polling places are your correct polling place. How great is that? Sarah says people need to know if they have to vote at their assigned precinct or if they are free to go anywhere on election day. This is one of the few very exciting, good, positive things in the Texas election code. And I, like Sarah, am passionate about people knowing and using it. All right. The next is from my friend Jonathan Diaz. He is a senior legal counsel for voting rights at the Campaign Legal Center out of DC. His myth was that people with criminal records or felony convictions can't vote. Of course, the truth is in many states, including Texas, they can. Voting after a conviction, a misdemeanor conviction rarely affects your ability to vote. In Texas, you can even vote absentee while incarcerated if you are serving a misdemeanor sentence. And in a couple of counties in Texas, you can vote while incarcerated at a polling place. Well, in one county so far, and hope optimistically more to come. But if you're interested in voting while incarcerated or anything to do with a criminal record and voting, my colleague Carl Blair did a presentation on that a few weeks ago, and we'll be circulating that to all of you who signed up at the end of this series. We'll send you all the videos, so highly recommend checking that out. Of course, in Texas, there are some election-related criminal activities that may be prosecutable under both election code and Texas laws, and that may turn a misdemeanor under the election code into a felony under other laws, depending on the specifics of the offense in question. Just one of the many great quirks of Texas law. Thank you to Carl for that research as well. Felonies, of course, my colleague Carl talked about this. A felony conviction does impact your right to vote in Texas, but not forever. In Texas, the right to vote is restored immediately and automatically when you become off paper. Off paper is just the term for completing a felony sentence, parole, probation, fines, costs, restitution. If this is the case, those voters do have to re-register. They don't stay on the voter rolls. But some states, I believe Florida used to do this. I don't think they still do. But some states require you to go before the governor and petition to win your right to vote back after a felony conviction. Another shockingly good thing about Texas is that you immediately are restored to your voting rights as soon as your conviction, the whole book is closed on your conviction. Up to 18 million Texans with past convictions can vote right now. They just don't know it because the felony disenfranchisement laws in every state are often confusing, and Texas is no exception. But the good news is they're confusing, but not quite as draconian as they could be, which I guess counts for good news in Texas. Next, we'll talk to hear from Molly Broadway. She's the Help America Vote Act trainer and technical specialist at Disability Rights Texas. I love Molly, and I love this picture of Molly that I stole from her LinkedIn because this is a very accurate to her personality one, I think. And we'll talk. I'll tell you guys the curbside story in just a moment that proves that. But Molly's myth is that voters who use curbside voting can just use their cell phone or voting assistant to request a curbside ballot at a polling site. No big deal. Just call in. You can get curbside voting, no problem. You can send your voter assistant inside to get them to come out with curbside. The truth is that not everyone has access to a cell phone. Not everyone communicates verbally, and not everyone has a voter assistant with them. A buzzer should be available at every curbside voting space. If this seems confusing, hang tight. I'm going to explain. Curbside voting is another thing in Texas that is accessibility at every polling place mandated by the Texas Election Code. This section here says all polling places in Texas must offer voting at the curb or the polling place entrance. You must be able to either not wait in line or not get out of your car if you have a disability, if you are physically unable to enter the polling place without personal assistance, or are likely to injure your health by entering the polling place. Some of you may remember in 2020, that definition does not necessarily extend to everyone who has COVID. So that was a whole nother thing. But it is available to people who are unable to enter the polling place without assistance or are likely to injure their health by entering the polling place. So what were we talking about with buzzers? This is how you get election workers to the curb. If you pull up to the curb and you want curbside voting, you can't just manifest that, right? Unfortunately, you do have to tell somebody that you want curbside voting and have them come out to you. So how do you get the election worker out to the curb where you are? Some polling places have a sign telling voters how to access curbside voting. Most, in my experience, most have a county phone number for you to call, and then you call the county calls the poll worker at your polling place, then the poll worker comes out. I know there are quite a few of you in this Zoom who've done election protection before, so you all know, I don't have to tell you, but the rest of you, I'm sure you can assume how much time it takes for the person to call the county with just the regular county number a lot of times. They often don't have a dedicated curbside voting number. And then the county, again, has to get on the phone with the poll worker. Once you finally do reach somebody, then the poll worker has to come out to you. I have been on a lot of calls with counties during election season. When I was looking for things for this PowerPoint, I came across a Slack message from a volunteer during the 2020 election who said, I just counted 40 rings before Bexar County picked up. It rang 40 times. So this is shockingly not the best way to get someone to come out in a timely manner for you to vote curbside if you have a disability. Some counties have a button or a buzzer that instantly notifies poll workers to come outside with curbside machines. Molly believes this should be the standard. I agree completely. And many voters don't have access to a cell phone, don't communicate verbally, or don't have an assistant, as Molly said. But for the most part, and obviously there's always going to be some exceptions, but for the most part, folks can ring a buzzer, can push this button to get someone to come out to the curb. And some counties, well, some counties have pitiful signs, like this sign at left that just says curbside voting. That does not, in my humble opinion, that does not meaningfully provide curbside voters with information about how to curbside vote. Some counties don't bother to put up signs at all, which to me, Emily Eby, essentially means that they are not providing curbside voting service. I know that technically they might still be, they might have the machine, they might come out to somebody, but I think if you pull up to the curb and there is nothing telling you how to vote curbside, curbside voting does not exist. It's sort of the tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it. Did it even make a sound? It's sort of that, but for disability accessibility, which is so much worse. I mentioned the Bexar County story just a second ago. We had I hate to say this, I didn't mean to do this, but it is going to be a pun, and I am going to say it. We had a real bear of a time getting Bexar County to put curbside voting signs out by the polling places. We had one volunteer call and wait 40 rings to get through to the county to say, hey, there's no curbside voting. They said, oh, we know. We had another volunteer call, and the person who answered said, if you want curbside signs so bad, then you can do it yourself, which, I think maybe needed a little bit more training for that particular county volunteer or employee, because that is not great customer service at the very least. But we eventually, in conjunction with Disability Rights Texas, were able to get those polling places to have curbside signs. There were a lot of other organizations we worked with as well. And if you want to learn more about that, because it was very exciting, you should read my wonderful friend and former colleague Wajiha Rizvi's report. You can go to tinyurl.com/curbside report. And I want you to know that I had this in the presentation even before Wajiha showed up on this presentation. So my admiration is true. But it is a really good report. Highly recommend visiting that. If only to make yourself more anxious about how curbside is going to go in 2022. Molly says, not all disabilities are visible. As an election worker, it's not your job to determine the validity of a person's disability status. I think about this so much in voting rights, and just what the standard for an election worker should be. But it's also important to think about what the standard for us should be. If we see somebody voting curbside and they seem fine, we might not be able to see their disability. Another myth that Molly mentioned that I didn't have time to include, but I thought was really good, is she says that a lot of times people think a deaf voter doesn't need, a deaf or hard of hearing voter does not need a voter assistant because they can just read the ballot. How are you going to help them? And Molly pointed out that a lot of folks who are deaf, who have hearing loss, a lot of those folks do not use the English language very much at all. Their primary language is American Sign Language, which the ballot is not printed in. And so I thought that was a really good point about a different kind of interpretation that I don't usually think of. I actually have hearing aids. I don't have severe hearing loss, but this is just one of those many things that you learn, I think, when you find out you have a disability. It's just always learning, which is really exciting for me. The next person we have is Mary Ibarra, who's the political coordinator at the ACLU of Texas. I love this. Mary was like, this is a hard policy point, and I want people to know. Her least favorite myth is that your address on your ID and your voter registration have to match one another. The truth is, they do not. The purpose of voter ID in Texas, other than voter suppression, which I'll get to in a second, is to prove your identity, not your residency. Your driver's license or ID card or election ID certificate or whatever proves who you are, not where you live. So it's not about you're proving your address, proving that you're voting in the right place, any of that stuff. It's just to say this person who's on the voter rolls is the same person who's here to vote. You can also, fun fact, vote with an expired photo ID. If you are younger than 70, you can only vote with an ID that's expired up to 4 years. But if you are over 70, you can vote with an ID that is expired for any length of time. And every time I say this, I have to talk about my voting rights election protection white whale. I would really like to talk to a person over 70 who votes with an ID that's been expired for like 10 to 20 to 50 years. If you hear of that person, my email address, Emily Eby at TexasCivilRightsProject.org. I am dying to see this because it is fully legal, and I think it would be really cool to know that it happened for a real voter. I love this quote from Mary. We need to keep lawmakers accountable, and we can't do that unless we vote. And she's an expert at that. All right, Zach Doling, one of our other staff attorneys at TCRP. I'll be honest and tell you guys that Zach and Sarah are featured in this PowerPoint mostly because they made the mistake of sitting nearby when I was working on this, and I forced them to tell me a myth or two they didn't like. Zach is a great litigator on our team. He's also involved in the SB1 lawsuit. He also does criminal and justice reform work. He's one of my personal heroes, but Zach said the myth he doesn't like is getting a photo ID is so easy. Anybody who thinks it's a burden is just being lazy and just doesn't want to vote. The truth is, it is really easy for some people, and it is really difficult for others. And I want to come to you all humbly and admit that I am giving this presentation as a person with an expired driver's license, and it has been such a pain to get my driver's license renewed. So this is particularly close to my heart right now. Getting a photo ID in Texas can be really hard. For one thing, it is very difficult to get to a DPS office without a car. Texas is one of the most car-dependent states in America. I'm sure that doesn't surprise anybody. According to the Federal Transit Administration, of the top 5 most populous metro areas, Houston had the second lowest public transit ridership in 2019. Houston residents took only 18 rides per resident in 2019, which is compared to New York City, where it's about 200 rides per resident. Dallas was lower than Houston at just 13 rides annually per resident. And you could say this is because a lot of people have a car. I think that is partly true, and partly because you have to have a car, because a car is a necessity, whereas in most big metro areas, it is, especially outside of Texas, it's not a necessity to have a car. In 2019, CityLab ranked DFW as the 5th worst metro area in the entire United States to navigate without a car. I would rank it pretty hard to navigate generally, but especially without a car. Arlington, Texas is the largest city in America to have no public transit system at all. So something that we all take for granted, well, something that a lot of us, me included, take for granted is that you can just hop in the car and get to your DPS appointment, no problem. But that is not the case for a lot of folks. And if they don't have a car, it's even harder than it is in most states to go and get a photo ID because of our terrible public transit system. Just another example of how every social justice issue is intersectional, right? Transit affects voting. It is also very hard to get prerequisite documents. So not the photo ID itself as much as the documents you have to get the photo ID. You have to bring an original or certified copy of a birth certificate. It has to be a special birth certificate. I tried to use mine to get a passport a few years ago and found out that my birth certificate wasn't new enough. So then I had to go and wait 8 hours at the birth certificate office to get a new birth certificate. And I was very lucky to have a job I could take off that day. A lot of people do not. I didn't lose money by not being at my job that day, right? I'm salaried. A lot of people are wage earners, hourly wage earners, where if you miss 8 hours of work, that's it. You just don't get the money that day. You also have to have a social security card, the actual card with you. If you had a name change, you have to have legal documents showing proof of your name change from your birth name, which is another intersectional issue because that kind of document is often difficult for transgender folks who have moved on from their dead name, but still have a lot of their documents in under their dead name. Who doesn't have these documents? A lot of people, including People who are born in other states who can't travel to get a new copy, you can get them mailed to you. It's very difficult and very annoying. People who are born at home or people who are born by midwife, a lot of rural folks are still born at home or by midwife, a lot of older folks especially, and sometimes they are not issued a birth certificate in the first place. Former foster children, one of my law school summers interviewed young homeless folks, folks experiencing homelessness all across Texas, Dallas, Austin, and Houston. And one of the things we heard over and over and over again is that, if they were coming out of the foster care system or had been booted out of the foster care system, they did not know where any of these documents were. They had not taken their birth certificate with them from house to house. Some parent had either their birth parent or their foster parent had lost it somewhere along the line. And so that is a really huge issue for both former foster children and Texans experiencing homelessness, a lot of which often overlaps. And in Texas, a huge percentage of those Texans experiencing homelessness, especially young ones, are LGBTQ because they've been kicked out of their homes by family who doesn't accept them. It all just flows together. In addition, if that's all not hard enough, DPS offices in Texas are extremely few and far between. Not every county in Texas has a DPS office. This map here, the gray ones are places with open DPS offices. The red ones are counties where the only DPS office is either closed or works on very, very temporary hours. In 2018, this map's current of 2012. In 2018, the DPS tried to close 87 more offices, 87. This would have left 68 counties without a DPS office. And you guessed it, those counties were mostly rural, poor, and communities of color. 2018 closures failed to pass. TCRP and all the organizations listed here and many legislators of both sides of the aisle rejected this. That was very exciting, but DPS is still trying to cut costs statewide rather than DPS getting more funding so that folks can be sure to get to a DPS office near them to get that driver's license or voter ID. I'm going to take a drink. Zach says, for people for whom it is easy to get an ID, they seem to lack the capacity to comprehend that it might be difficult for someone else. You see this with a lot of civil rights issues, including policing. It's a lack of empathy. Zach and I then went on to complain about how a lot of these Supreme Court justices, when they do traffic stop cases, do not understand how traffic stops work because most of these Supreme Court justices have not driven themselves in 20 years. And you can tell that when you read the opinion. And so I really like thinking about voter ID as something that is suppressive, even though it wouldn't suppress me. Cindy Weatherby, I will level with you guys that I did not find out Cindy's official title. I was tempted to put voting rights genius on here, but I think she would have blushed a little at that. She is a former board president and current member of the League of Women Voters of Texas. She's also on this call, so she can correct me with her official title. But Cindy gave me a couple of myths, and I really liked this one. The myth is it's hard to vote in Texas because there are no trusted nonpartisan resources to learn when to vote, where to vote, and what the candidates believe. And the truth is, of course there are. This is something that I have seen a lot with my family and people I grew up with in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is, if this is Texas, then it's like right here, not in the Panhandle, but close to Oklahoma. And a lot of them do not trust partisan voting resources because they think, why are they telling me what to think? And it's been, it's fun to introduce them to things like the things I'm going to mention in the next slide that really do help and really don't have an agenda. You just have to know where to look. So these are things that I would say y'all should encourage your community to utilize. Your county's election website, the websites and social media accounts of all the organizations included here. I fully endorse all of them. Nonpartisan sites like vote411.org and the ever useful League of Women Voters Guide, which is published before early voting every election. Cindy wants voters to know that there are reliable, nonpartisan, independent sources that offer truthful, helpful information about the voting process, the candidates, the job descriptions for the offices the candidates are running for, and getting help registered and preparing to vote. These organizations don't tell voters who to vote for, and they respect a voter's right to make their own decisions. If you call the 866-OUR-VOTE hotline in the fall, you could call and tell me exactly who you're voting for, and it could be my nemesis from high school or like my childhood bully, and I would still help you vote for that person if that's who you want to vote for, because we're nonpartisan, and I really do just want more people to vote. There's some guides here that you can point your neighbors toward and use themselves. The League of Women Voters Guide in particular reaches out to all the candidates, regardless of the party, and reprints their answers to questions word for word in that voter guide to help you make your decisions. Of course, not every candidate responds, but every candidate that responds gets in the voter guide quoted word for word. It's a great way to decide which candidates to support, and it can be found at Vote 411 or on your local League of Women Voters website. It's especially good to get the print edition because you can't have your phone out in the polling place, and I always forget that when I'm going to vote, and I always have to scribble it down on a piece of paper right before I run out the door, unless I have thought ahead and picked up the League of Women Voters Guide. And I cheated a little bit and included this from Cindy's other myth that she gave me, but I thought it was a great quote. It can be challenging to vote. Hey, Texas is often rated #1 hardest to vote in state. Because it is, there are a multitude of organizations offering information and assistance to help Texas citizens proudly vote. These nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations offer accurate, unbiased help that can be trusted. It is available by telephone, online, and sometimes in person. All Texans should know that their vote is powerful and does matter. Says it all. I do love the silver lining of Texas is one of the hardest to vote in states, and because of that, look at all these wonderful organizations we have here trying to help you vote. That is certainly a trauma bond we Texans share. All right, I'm going to close this out with my most philosophical voting rights buddy, Alex Brunell, the advocacy director at Move Texas, a long time voting advocate and a great thinker. I don't understand how he is always reading a book that's like the size of my head and doing all the work he does, but it makes for a very smart and intellectual individual and a really good voting rights myth. Alex's myth is, if voter turnout is low, it's because people are apathetic. It's because they're not interested in participating in our democracy. The truth, our government produces the condition of voter apathy by not investing in elections. Everything you've heard tonight is important for voting, is a practical thing you can use when you go to the polls in the fall. And in Texas, a lot of times those practical things end up being what the bare minimum, right? Texas is doing the least it absolutely can to help people vote. And it's really important to know how to get around that, how to actually vote, how to get around Texas hating people using their voice to vote. But I like this to end on because Alex wants us to imagine a better way to do democracy. Voter apathy also came up with several other folks. Cindy brought it up, and I believe Amber brought it up as well. And that's because every single election, there are 100 million stories that's like, on the sidelines of democracy, why don't Americans vote? U.S. trailed most developed countries in voter turnout. Voter apathy strikes again, San Antonio. And I am not criticizing the media. I understand why you would think that voters are apathetic. But there are not every nation that has voters, not every nation that runs elections has voter apathy, because not every nation that runs elections puts the entire onus on the voter. Alex, if Alex were running society, in which case we would all be a lot better off, but Alex would say, put your money where your vote is. He thinks voter apathy is created by our system of government, not the other way around, and thinks that if we invest in creating a civic culture and rebuilding civic infrastructure, then we can create a pro-voter culture, and you'll never see voter apathy again, quote unquote voter apathy. Government agencies must extend a hand to voters instead of forcing voters to do all the heavy lifting. The rules and technicalities in Texas law become hurdles to participation, and you don't blame the person who doesn't jump over the hurdles, right? You blame the system that put the hurdles there in the first place, or oftentimes the person that put the hurdles there in the first place. I won't name names, but we can do another, CLE hour where I name names. Alex calls Texas a voter hostile environment. So right now I'm gonna, veer a little bit from what Alex gave me and talk to y'all about 3 voter systems. Number 1, the process to find your polling place in the voter hostile state of Texas. Number 2, the process to find your polling place in the more voter friendly state of Colorado, and the voter proactive elections in India. How do you find your polling place in Texas? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. That's going to be really easy. Are you voting during early voting or on election day? If you're voting during early voting, you can vote at any polling place in your county, but you have to go to your county's election website. Some counties have an interactive map, but sometimes you have to look for a PDF that lists all the hours of the polling places in your county. Scroll through the polling places till you find one that's close to you. You might have to look it up in your Maps app, then check the hours and drive to the polling place during those hours. That is if you have a car. Otherwise, you'll have to figure out the bus route to that polling place if your city has public transportation, or else you'll have to walk. Hopefully the weather is good. If there's a long line, you can go back to the PDF list and find a polling place that has a shorter line. If you're voting on election day, you just have to figure out if you're in a countywide polling county. So you have to go to the Texas Secretary of State website, look up whether your county has been approved as a countywide polling county. If it has, then you follow on the steps of A above. If your county is not a countywide polling county, you have to figure out your precinct. You have to go to the Texas Secretary of State's website and look up your registration and find your precinct, your correct precinct, your polling place. Then check the election day hours, which 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and then drive to the polling place during those hours. That is, if you have a car. Otherwise, you have to figure out the bus route to your polling place. If your city has public transportation, else you have to walk. Hopefully, the weather's good. If there's a long line, which is extremely likely on election day, you will have to wait in that line. You can't go anywhere else. Isn't it great here? Isn't this so fun? Don't we love voting like this? In Texas, you also have to hope that your polling place wasn't closed while you weren't looking. In 2012, before Shelby County, the Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act, in 2012, you had 1 polling place per 4,000 Texans. In 2018, you had 1 polling place per 7,700 Texans. They are dropping like flies. If you can believe it, the 50 counties in Texas that gained the most Black and Latinx residents between 2012 and 2018 closed 542 polling places, even though there was a population increase of 2.5 million people in those 50 counties. The 50 counties that gained the fewest Black and Latinx residents closed 34 polling places. I'm sure that's all just a coincidence, even though the population did decrease in those areas. I'm sure this is all just a coincidence and has nothing to do with systemic racism at all. That was sarcasm. It has everything to do with systemic racism. And I know that these counties closing polling locations seems bad on the county. It is bad on the county. It's also bad on the state that's underfunding the county, right? That money comes from somewhere. And in Texas, that line item for elections is not big enough. Or if it's big enough, it has a big chunk cut out for non-existent election fraud. How do you find your polling place in Colorado? Look at this slide. It's so much friendlier than our Texas slide. Colorado mails a ballot to every registered voter a few weeks before the election. You got to keep an eye on your mailbox. Make sure you get that ballot. Mail it back before election day. You could also drop it in one of your county's drop boxes. That you would have to look up on the website, but you can go to a drop box. Nobody has to check in your ballot, and they offer more than one. And you can vote in person if you want, which you would also have to look up. I'm not sure if you have an assigned precinct in Colorado or if you can go to anywhere in your county, but this is what it would look like to still be in the United States, but be friendlier to voting. Of course, Colorado isn't perfect, but they do invest in this civic culture that Alex Burnell was talking about. How to find your polling place in India. This is what it would look like to live in a society that is voter proactive. And like Colorado, India is not perfect. But I think that they do a much better job of seeking out voters than we ever have in the United States, in any of our states. I highly recommend my source for these slides, which is a Reuters piece called Roads, Boats, and Elephants: How India Mobilized a Million Polling Stations. Pictured on this slide is the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. It is home to 200 million people. And in 2019, the ECI, which is the Election Commission of India, ran 160,000 polling places. And you can see them in orange on this map. And I know that a map without a thorough scale is kind of difficult, but the density of these polling places is amazing to me. The Election Commission of India has guidelines that say no voter should be more than 1.24 miles away from a polling station. It blows my mind because I am the most unathletic person in the world, and I could walk 1.24 miles, which of course would be like 2.48 by the time I was done voting. But I could walk that much. It's just flabbergasting to me that they would put these polling places so close to folks. The ECI runs literally 1 million polling places across the country of India during its elections. The average polling place serves 900 voters. That's one polling place per 900 voters. You'll remember in Texas, we are at, in 2018, we are at one polling place per 7,700 Texans, which is exponentially worse and more embarrassing. And each election year, the ECI hires over 11 million officials to work each election, and you will see why. This is what it looks like to run an election in India. Nearly 11 million government officials and security forces were deployed to run polling places back in 2019, traveling by foot, road, special train, helicopter, boat, and sometimes by elephant. On the left, you'll see polling officers carrying electronic voting machines to their cars after arriving on a ferry. And on the right, you will see, and these on the left are in the northeastern Indian state of Assam. And on the right, you'll see poll officers carrying voting machines through the Buxa Tiger Reserve forest to a remote polling station in the eastern state of West Bengal, India. In Texas, where we force voters to trek, travel, get there by hook or by crook, it is so hard to imagine putting that burden on the government. But it is amazing to look at these pictures and see that there are places who care that much about every single vote that they traverse these, beaches and mountains to get the polling place to the voters. The village of Tashigang in the Himalayas is the highest polling location in the world. It is 15,000 feet above sea level. It served only 49 voters in 2019, but they took helicopters out because they wanted to get the vote of those 49 voters. The polling place in the village of Ka is 9,700 feet above sea level. That one serves only 16 voters, but they make the trek because every vote counts. It's hard, you can't even imagine every vote counts meaning more than taking a helicopter to get 49 votes. Alex says apathy individualizes the problem. Demobilization is the project of vote suppressors, and they defund elections and overcomplicate the process to make it happen. But there is nothing stopping us from making it a mobilization effort, making it on the state, the onus on the state to find every vote and make it count, every eligible vote. There's nothing stopping us except ourselves. Oh man, what can I do to help? Emily, this is so bleak. How can we fix it? It's not, okay, it is bleak. But if you are an attorney or if you're not an attorney, you can sign up to be an election protection legal volunteer at txcivilrights.org/22EP legal, 22EP legal. You would be, if you were a legal volunteer, And I know there are non-lawyers on the call as well, but legal volunteers provide customer service for Texas voters to help navigate some of these draconian laws and jump over these hurdles we've talked about, solving little voting rights Rubik's cubes of issues. All the law school hypos come to life to help voters exercise their rights. And we will be operating command centers all across Texas during early voting and on election day to address these issues, systemic or individual, and to file litigation if necessary, because we love to sue when Texas does something wrong. All right, I'll take questions in just a sec, but I'm going to leave this slide up. Thank you all so much for coming. Here is your CLE number. You can also scan that QR code with your phone if you are logged in on your phone, and it'll directly count your CLE credit. Thank you all so much for joining. This has been really fun. It is so good to meet with y'all every Wednesday night and talk about voting stuff. And thank you, Josh. The love is mutual. And thank y'all for joining. I'll stick around to answer some questions in the Q&A box. We've got one from Leola that says, on the Texas Secretary of State Facebook page, they've posted about a free election ID certificate mobile station. Do you know if this is actually used? Leola, I do not. I didn't know they had a mobile station. I am going to look into that. I hope that they are using it. The election ID certificates require a lot of prerequisite documents to get. It's, Texas's, the election ID certificate is Texas saying, look, you don't have to get a driver's license. We're going to get you a real easy one, a little ID card just so you can vote. But it is only good, I believe, for one election or a year. It's a very limited time, not like a driver's license where you can, it expires years out from when it is issued. So I will look into that mobile station. I hope they are using it. That would be uncharacteristically very nice of Texas to do that, to combat some of those transportation problems we mentioned. All right. Any other questions from folks? We will circulate. Oh, Michelle, perfect. You jumped right in with the question I was about to answer. You read my mind. I love it. We will circulate the previous sessions over email, the email you gave us to register for this Zoom. I will send all of those around. We will post the videos pretty quickly here so you can watch other sessions. We are also going to, it'll take a little bit more time, but we will post them again with a new CLE number, because you have to have a different CLE number if it's pre-recorded versus if it is live. But we'll post those again with a new CLE number if folks missed a session and you're a lawyer and you want that sweet, sweet CLE credit. That'll take us a little bit more time since TCRP is closed next week. But we'll have all the versions of these presentations available for y'all. Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you all so much. I'm trying to gender neutralize it, and Texas has the perfect gender neutral you all term in y'all. It's amazing. Another good thing we have here by accident. Thank you all so much. Hope you've enjoyed this series as much as I have, and hopefully we'll see you in the fall.